Normandy, France, late July 1944. 3 miles behind the front line, in a hedgerow field outside St. Lo, a man named Curtis Culin kneels beside a burned-out German beach obstacle, running his hand along a rusted steel tooth. Around him, engines idle. A Sherman tank sits with its rear deck open, 2 mechanics elbow-deep in the transmission housing, working by flashlight because the sun went down 40 minutes ago. Nobody has slept in 19 hours. A field radio crackles with a unit designation and a grid reference. Culin doesn't look up. He is welding scrap iron to the front of a tank, and he does not yet know that what he is building in this field tonight will be copied onto more than 500 tanks within 2 weeks. Sergeant Curtis Culin is 26 years old, 1st Army, 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. He is carrying a torch, not a rifle. Around him is the wreckage of the bocage campaign hedgerows so thick and so old that Sherman tanks climbing over them exposed their unarmoured bellies to German anti-tank fire, and men were dying for every field. Culin does not know he is about to solve a problem that has stalled the entire Allied advance through Normandy. He only knows that a soldier in his unit joked about needing some saw teeth to cut through the hedges instead of climbing them. He is not an engineer. He is a mechanic with a welding torch, and 11 hours before dawn. This is not a story about a tank attachment. It is a story about what happens when an army builds its logistics system to absorb genius from the bottom instead of waiting for it to arrive from the top. The German army had better tanks, better armour, better guns. What it did not have, what it structurally could not have, was a maintenance and ordnance system built to take an idea from a sergeant's welding torch to 500 tanks in 14 days. This is a story about the Second Army behind the army, the ordnance battalions, the field workshops, the men who never fired a shot and who may have shortened the war by more than any single battle. The tank won battles. The workshop behind it won the war. To understand why an American field workshop could turn one sergeant's idea into a fleet modification in under 2 weeks, you have to go back further than Normandy. Back to a set of decisions made in Detroit and in the US Army's Ordnance Department more than a decade before the war began. In the 1930s, American industrial planners made a choice that seemed almost unglamorous at the time: standardization. Not the best possible tank, not the most elegant design. A tank and a truck and a jeep and an engine, built from parts that were interchangeable across factories, across units, across theatres. The M4 Sherman, when it entered mass production in 1942, was not designed to be unbeatable in a one-on-one duel with a German Panther or Tiger. It was designed to be repairable by a 20-year-old mechanic with a toolkit in the field, in under a day, using parts that could be shipped from any depot in the supply chain. This decision came from men like General Levin Campbell, Chief of Ordnance, and from the doctrine built around the Army's ordnance maintenance companies, units whose entire purpose was not to fight, but to keep the fighting force moving. By 1944, the US Army had built an ordnance structure that included forward collection points, mobile machine shops mounted on trucks, and battalions trained specifically to cannibalize, repair, and rebuild vehicles within hours of battle damage, sometimes under fire. Germany's approach was almost the opposite. The Wehrmacht fielded some of the most formidable tanks of the war, the Panther, the Tiger, but each was hand-fitted, mechanically complex, and dependent on specialized parts that could take weeks to manufacture and ship. A damaged Tiger often required a factory-level rebuild. A damaged Sherman could be back in action, sometimes with a swapped engine, before its crew finished their coffee. By the time Curtis Culin picked up his welding torch in a Norman hedgerow field, he was standing on top of a decade of institutional decisions that made his invention possible to scale. The idea was his. The system that turned it into 500 tanks in 2 weeks belonged to the ordnance battalions. Here is what that system actually looked like on the ground. Each US infantry and armoured division had an attached ordnance maintenance company, and behind those, Corps-level ordnance battalions ran forward collection points where damaged vehicles were triaged like wounded soldiers, repairable on the spot, repairable with parts from the depot, or beyond saving and stripped for components. Mobile machine shops, built into modified trucks, carried lathes, welding equipment, and spare parts kits directly to the front, sometimes within a mile of active fighting. The numbers tell the story numbers always tell in this war. Between June and August 1944, US Ordnance units in Normandy processed tens of thousands of vehicle repairs. Engine swaps on a Sherman, a job that would sideline a tank for days in a conventional repair depot, were routinely completed by trained crews in 4 to 6 hours. Transmission replacements, done overnight. A knocked-out bogie wheel or track section replaced before the crew finished eating. When Culin's hedge-cutting device, soon nicknamed the Rhino, built from scavenged German steel beach obstacles left over from the Atlantic Wall defences, proved itself in a field test in front of General Omar Bradley in mid-July 1944, the response was not a committee. It was an order down the ordnance chain: replicate it fast. Within roughly 2 weeks, ordnance units across First Army had fabricated and welded an estimated 300 to 500 Rhino devices onto Sherman tanks, using scrap metal recovered from the very beach defences the Germans had built to stop the invasion in the first place. Think about what that means for a moment. The Germans built steel obstacles to destroy the invasion. The American ordnance system melted those obstacles down and welded them onto the front of tanks that broke through the hedgerows those same Germans were using to hold the line. This is where the like button matters, if it matters to you at all. Not for the channel, but because this is the kind of story that gets buried under the bigger battles. If it deserves to stay visible, that's the only reason that counts. Then we keep going. The Rhino-fitted Shermans spearheaded Operation Cobra at the end of July 1944, the breakout that finally cracked the Normandy stalemate. Tanks that once had to climb exposed over hedgerows now punched straight through them, engines roaring, while German anti-tank crews who had ranged their guns for the old approach found their kill zones useless. German officers who fought through the bocage campaign wrote afterward about a war they had planned for and a war that arrived instead. The hedgerow terrain had been counted on as a natural fortress, a place where superior German tank armour and gun ranges would compensate for Allied numbers. Field commanders had built their defensive doctrine around Allied tanks being forced to expose their thin belly armour climbing over each hedgeline, one field at a time, for weeks. What German after-action reports and post-war accounts describe instead is confusion at the sudden appearance of tanks that no longer climbed. Tanks that simply drove through the hedgerows as if they were paper, at a pace the German defensive plan had never accounted for. Officers of the Panzer Lehr Division and the 2nd SS Panzer Division, units that had bled the Americans badly through June and early July, found their carefully ranged defensive positions rendered obsolete almost overnight during Operation Cobra. This was not a story of a superior weapon defeating an inferior one. German tanks remained, gun for gun, often superior to the Sherman. What the German command could not counter was a modification cycle, an idea tested, replicated, and fielded across an army in roughly 2 weeks. Nothing in the Wehrmacht's centralized, factory-dependent production and repair system could match that speed, and the men who had spent a decade being told German engineering was unmatched now faced an enemy who had simply out-organized them. The mechanics who built the Rhinos and who kept the Shermans running were not decorated for it. Most of their names never made it into the history books that cover Operation Cobra. They worked in the open, often within artillery range, welding through the night because a tank sitting idle was a tank that could not protect the infantry advancing past it in the morning. Ordnance crews took casualties too. Men killed not in tank duels but in the collection points and forward repair yards that German artillery occasionally found. A mechanic working under a half-track at 2 in the morning had no more protection than the infantryman beside him and considerably less chance of being remembered afterward. He carried a wrench instead of a rifle, and that was often the only difference between his war and the war fought by the men in the tanks he repaired. If your grandfather or great-uncle served in an ordnance battalion, a maintenance company, or a repair depot in this campaign, his name belongs in the comments. His unit, his theatre, what he remembered. Those details are the actual record of what happened, the kind that does not survive in official histories built around the units that did the shooting. Germany never built an equivalent to the American ordnance system, not because German engineers lacked the skill, but because German military culture prized the perfect machine over the repairable one, and a rigid top-down production doctrine over a system that trusted a 26-year-old sergeant with a welding torch to solve a problem the general staff could not. Back in that hedgerow field outside St. Lo, Curtis Culin is still welding when the sun comes up. He does not know yet that what he built in one night will punch through the German line at Operation Cobra within 2 weeks, or that ordnance crews across an entire army will spend that fortnight turning scavenged German steel into the tool that breaks the German defence. He only knows the torch is hot and the tank needs to be ready by morning. The war was not only won by the men who pulled triggers, it was won, in fields like this one, by men who were never issued medals for what they built, and whose quiet, relentless work turned an army's ideas into an army's advance, one welded plate at a time.